I pulled into the gravel parking lot of Murphy's Diner just as the sun was disappearing behind the mountains, and honestly, the place looked exactly like what you'd expect from a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. Faded red siding, neon sign that probably hadn't been updated since the 80s, and that particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the only building visible in any direction. The pay was what got me here. $18 an hour for night shift work was more than I'd made at any of my previous jobs in Anchorage, and right now I needed every dollar I could get. My savings account was basically a joke, and my landlord had made it pretty clear that "I'll get it to you next week" wasn't going to work much longer. Douglas Harper was waiting for me by the front door, keys jingling in his hand like he couldn't wait to get out of here. He looked like every diner owner I'd ever met. Stocky guy in his 50s with permanently stained fingers and the kind of tired eyes that said he'd been dealing with difficult customers for way too long. "You're Edna, right?" He didn't wait for me to answer before pushing open the door. "Come on, I want to get you set up before it gets too dark." The inside was standard diner fare: red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floor, and that particular smell of old grease and industrial coffee that seemed to be required by law in places like this. The counter ran along one side with maybe 8 stools, and there was a pass-through window to what I assumed was the kitchen. "Pretty straightforward setup," Douglas said, walking me behind the counter. "Coffee machines here, registers here, menus simple enough that most people just order burgers or breakfast food anyway." He gestured toward a door in the back. "Storage room, employee bathroom, and the kitchen's through there." I nodded, trying to look like I was paying attention to his tour instead of calculating how many shifts I'd need to work to catch up on rent. The math wasn't great, but it was better than anything else I'd found. Now, about the previous girl who worked nights. Douglas stopped moving and looked at me directly for the first time. "Jacqueline, she was here for 2 years, never missed a shift, never caused any problems. Then 3 days ago she calls me crying, says she can't come back after what happened with some customer." "What kind of customer?" I asked, because that seemed like the obvious question. Douglas shook his head. "She wouldn't say, just kept repeating that she couldn't do it anymore and hung up. Haven't heard from her since." That was weird, but people quit jobs for all kinds of reasons. Maybe she'd finally had enough of some drunk trucker getting handsy, or maybe she'd just reached her breaking point with the isolation. I'd been there myself. "The thing is," Douglas continued, "the night shift worker before Jacqueline left under similar circumstances just up and disappeared one day, didn't even come back for his final paycheck." Okay, that was a little more concerning. But again, people were unpredictable. Maybe the guy had found something better, or maybe he'd just decided Alaska wasn't for him. It happened. Douglas walked over to the wall behind the register and tapped a laminated piece of paper that was taped there. "These are the rules for night shift. I need you to read them carefully and follow them exactly." I stepped closer to look at the list, expecting the usual stuff about keeping the coffee fresh and not giving free food to friends. Instead, I found myself reading the weirdest employee guidelines I'd ever seen. Rule 1. If a customer enters wearing wet clothes, serve them warm milk immediately and do not engage in conversation. I read it out loud because I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Rule 2. If you see something wrong with a customer's reflection in the windows, go to the storage room and wait until they leave. Douglas was watching me read with an expression I couldn't quite figure out. Not embarrassed exactly, but definitely uncomfortable. Rule 3. If someone claims to need help or wants to use the phone, direct them to the phone by the restroom, but do not offer additional assistance. I kept going because this was getting ridiculous. Rule 4. If the stove makes a ding sound while cooking, stop immediately and throw away all food. Rule 5. Do not serve coffee between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Rule 6. If you hear knocking after midnight, do not answer the door. I looked up at Douglas, waiting for him to laugh or explain that this was some kind of initiation prank for new employees. Instead, he just stood there looking serious. I know they sound strange, he said finally, but these rules exist for good reasons. They're not suggestions or local quirks. They're safety measures that need to be followed exactly. Safety measures? I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. What kind of safety issue requires warm milk? Douglas's jaw tightened. The kind that made Jacqueline quit crying and made the guy before her disappear. Look, I'm not asking you to understand them. I'm asking you to follow them. The smart thing would have been to walk away right then. Every instinct I had was telling me that this was exactly the kind of weird situation I should avoid. But $18 an hour was $18 an hour, and my grandmother had always said that every job came with its own particular brand of nonsense. Fine, I said. I'll follow your rules. Douglas looked relieved, which was almost more unsettling than the rules themselves. Good. The dinner rush is pretty much over by the time you start, so you'll mostly get truckers stopping for coffee and maybe some late-night travelers. Keep the coffee fresh, keep the grill clean, and remember what I told you about the rules. He was already heading toward the door, clearly eager to leave. I'll be back at 6 a.m. to open for breakfast. You've got my number if there's an emergency, but try not to call unless it's really serious. Wait, I called after him. What about training? Shouldn't you stick around for at least the first hour or something? Douglas paused with his hand on the door handle. You've worked in restaurants before, right? It's not complicated. Just remember the rules, and you'll be fine. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a diner that suddenly felt a lot bigger and quieter than it had a few minutes ago. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind outside. Through the windows, I could see Douglas's truck pulling out of the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the empty road before disappearing into the darkness. That's when Dolly Weaver appeared at the front door, tapping on the glass. I recognized her from Douglas's description, the day shift waitress who'd been working here for a few months. She was a black woman in her late 50s with graying hair and the kind of practical clothes that said she'd been on her feet all day. I unlocked the door to let her in. Hey, you must be Dolly. Douglas said you might stop by. That's right. She stepped inside and looked around the diner like she was checking to make sure everything was in its proper place. I wanted to meet you before you got too settled in. There was something in her tone that made me pay attention. Not unfriendly exactly, but definitely serious. I heard you're taking over Jacqueline's shift, Dolly continued. She was a good worker, reliable. It's not like her to just quit without notice. Douglas mentioned she had some kind of problem with a customer. Dolly nodded slowly. That's what he told me too. But I've been working here for 6 months, and I've never seen Jacqueline get rattled by difficult customers. She could handle drunk truckers and rude travelers better than anyone. She walked over to the counter and glanced at the rules posted behind the register. When she looked back at me, her expression was concerned. Listen, honey, I don't know you well enough to tell you what to do with your life, but if I were you, I'd start looking for another job. Soon. Why? I asked. What's wrong with this place? Dolly was quiet for a long moment, like she was trying to decide how much to say. There's something not right about the night shift here. I can't put my finger on it, but I've noticed things. The way the building feels different after dark. The way Douglas gets nervous whenever anyone mentions the night workers. The way people just leave. She headed back toward the door, then paused. Those rules behind the counter? Don't dismiss them as nonsense. I don't know what they're really about, but I've been working in diners for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like them. You think they're serious? I think Douglas is scared of something, and I think that's why he pays night shift workers double what anyone else makes around here. Dolly opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air. Just be careful, okay? And if something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Then she was gone, too, leaving me alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and a growing sense that I'd gotten myself into something more complicated than a simple waitressing job. I walked back behind the counter and read through the rules again, trying to make sense of them. Warm milk for wet customers, wrong reflections, mysterious dings from the stove. It all sounded like the kind of local folklore my grandmother used to tell me about spirits and old warnings that people pass down without really understanding why. But Dolly's words kept echoing in my head. Douglas is scared of something. I looked out the windows at the darkness surrounding the diner. We really were in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was Katina, and that was just a handful of buildings and maybe 200 people. The highway stretched in both directions without any other lights visible, making Murphy's Diner feel like the only inhabited place for miles. The isolation was heavier than I'd expected. In Anchorage, even working late shifts, there was always the sense of a city around you, people in other buildings, traffic on the streets, the general buzz of human activity. Here, there was just silence and darkness, and the feeling that anything could come out of that emptiness without warning. I shook off the creepy thoughts and focused on practical things. The coffee machine was straightforward enough, and the menu was simple: burgers, sandwiches, breakfast food, and basic sides. The register was older but functional. Everything seemed normal and manageable. $18 an hour, I reminded myself. That was what mattered. Whatever weirdness came with this job, I could handle it for a few months while I saved up enough money to get back on my feet. I'd dealt with difficult customers before, and I'd worked plenty of isolated night shifts. I settled onto the stool behind the counter and tried to ignore the way the windows reflected the diner's interior like dark mirrors, making it impossible to see what might be moving around outside in the parking lot. The rules were probably just Douglas's way of dealing with the kind of strange characters you'd encounter on a remote highway. Truckers who'd been driving too long, travelers who'd gotten lost or stranded, maybe some locals with particular quirks that regular employees had learned to accommodate. That had to be it, because the alternative, that there was something genuinely dangerous about working nights at Murphy's Diner, was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life. I checked the clock on the wall. 8:47 p.m. It was going to be a long night, but I'd had plenty of those before. I could handle whatever came through that door. At least that's what I told myself as I sat there in the fluorescent light, surrounded by darkness and silence, waiting for my first customer to arrive. I stared at the clock for what felt like the 100th time. 10:23 p.m. 2 hours down, 8 to go. The diner had been completely dead since Douglas left. Not a single car had even driven past on the highway, which was starting to feel more unsettling than busy would have been. I'd reorganized the napkin dispensers twice, wiped down every surface until it gleamed, and checked the coffee machine so many times I could probably rebuild it from memory. The silence was getting to me in a way I hadn't expected. In Anchorage, even the quietest night shifts had background noise, traffic, sirens, people walking by. Here, there was just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. The front door chime made me jump so hard I nearly knocked over the sugar dispenser. A man stepped through the door, and immediately I knew something was wrong. His clothes were completely soaked, not damp from a light drizzle, but soaked like he'd been standing under a waterfall. Water dripped steadily from his dark hair, his shirt, his jeans, creating a growing puddle on the linoleum with each step. His shoes made wet, squelching sounds that echoed in the empty diner. But here's the thing. It wasn't raining outside. Hadn't been all evening. I'd been looking out those windows for 2 hours straight, and the night was clear and dry. The man walked directly to the counter and sat down on one of the stools, never taking his eyes off me. His stare was intense in a way that made my skin crawl. Not aggressive exactly, but focused with an uncomfortable intensity that made me want to look anywhere else. Water kept dripping from him onto the floor, onto the counter, even onto the stool. It was like he was carrying his own personal rainstorm. "Milk!" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like he'd shouted. "I need milk." My brain went completely blank for a second, then snapped back to those ridiculous rules Douglas had made me memorize. Rule 1. If a customer enters wearing wet clothes, serve them warm milk immediately, and do not engage in conversation. This had to be a coincidence, some kind of weird local thing that Douglas had encountered before. Maybe truckers who'd gotten caught in sudden weather, or people whose vehicles had broken down in the rain. There was probably a perfectly logical explanation for why this guy was soaking wet on a clear night. But $18 an hour meant following the boss's rules, even the weird ones. I turned to the small microwave behind the counter and poured milk from the carton into a glass mug. The whole time I could feel him watching me, and when I glanced back, his pale eyes were still fixed on my face with that same unsettling intensity. The microwave hummed as it heated the milk, and I forced myself to smile politely while avoiding direct eye contact. "Just getting that warmed up for you," I said, then immediately wondered if that counted as engaging in conversation. He didn't respond anyway, just kept staring. When the microwave dinged, I pulled out the mug and set it in front of him on the counter. The milk was steaming slightly, and I'd managed to heat it to that perfect temperature that was warm but not scalding. The man picked up the glass and drank the entire thing in one continuous gulp, not sipping, not pausing to breathe, just one long, steady swallow that should have been impossible. The whole time, his eyes never left mine. I opened my mouth to ask if he needed anything else, then caught myself. Do not engage in conversation. That was pretty clear, so I stood there behind the counter, trying to look busy while this soaking wet stranger sat in complete silence. Water continued dripping from his clothes, creating a puddle that was spreading across the floor. The sound was rhythmic and somehow wrong, too steady, too persistent, like a leaky faucet that never quite stopped. 15 minutes passed. I cleaned the same section of counter 3 times, refilled napkin dispensers that were already full, and tried not to stare at the growing pool of water around his stool. The smell was starting to get to me, not just wet clothes, but something metallic and sharp that made my stomach turn. Then, without warning, he stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out exact change, $3.50, and placed it carefully on the counter next to his empty mug. Still no words. Still that intense stare that made me feel like he was looking through me rather than at me. He walked to the door with those same squelching footsteps, pushed it open, and stepped out into the night. I rushed to the window to watch him leave, expecting to see a car or truck in the parking lot. But there was nothing, just empty gravel and darkness beyond the reach of the diner's lights. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see where he'd gone, but it was like he'd simply vanished into the night. When I looked down at the floor where he'd been sitting, the puddle was still there, bigger than it should have been, spreading in a perfect circle that reflected the fluorescent lights above. The metallic smell was stronger now, making me gag slightly. I grabbed the mop from the storage room and started cleaning up the water, but the smell got worse as I worked. It wasn't just metallic. There was something organic underneath it, something that reminded me of the fish processing plant back in Juneau, where my grandmother used to work. By the time I'd mopped up all the water and sprayed the area with disinfectant, my hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the growing realization that Douglas's rules weren't random nonsense. That first rule had been specific and accurate down to the smallest detail. If a customer enters wearing wet clothes, serve them warm milk immediately and do not engage in conversation. Someone had written that rule because they'd encountered exactly what I'd just experienced. Someone had figured out the right way to handle a situation that made no logical sense, and they'd written it down so the next person wouldn't have to figure it out on their own. I looked at the list of rules again, reading them with new attention. If these weren't just Douglas being eccentric, if they were actual instructions for actual situations I might encounter, then I needed to take them seriously. The thought should have made me grab my keys and walk out right then. Any reasonable person would have left, but I kept thinking about my rent, about my empty savings account, about the fact that I had nowhere else to go. And maybe, if I was being honest with myself, I was curious. My grandmother had always told stories about things that existed just outside normal understanding. things that most people dismissed but that you ignored at your own risk. I'd spent years telling myself those were just stories, but that man had been real. The water had been real. The smell had been real. I settled back onto my stool behind the counter and tried to focus on normal things, keeping the coffee fresh, watching for actual customers who might want actual food. But I couldn't stop thinking about those pale eyes and the way he'd drunk that milk like his life depended on it. Outside, the highway remained empty and dark, but now I found myself watching the windows more carefully, paying attention to the shadows beyond the parking lot, wondering what else might come walking through that door before dawn. The rules were starting to make sense, and that scared me more than anything else that had happened tonight. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when the door burst open so hard it slammed against the wall. A woman stumbled in, and my first instinct was to reach for the first aid kit. Her face was a mess, dark bruises spreading across her left cheek, a split lip that was still bleeding, and her blonde hair was tangled like she'd been in a fight. She wore a torn white t-shirt and jeans, and she was breathing hard like she'd been running. "Please," she gasped, looking around the diner frantically. "I need to use your phone. My boyfriend, he hit me, and I need to call someone. Please, I don't have my cell and I need help." Every fiber of my being wanted to grab some ice for her face, offer her a place to sit, maybe make her some coffee while she calmed down. This was exactly the kind of situation where you helped another woman, no questions asked. But Douglas's rules were echoing in my head, especially after what had happened with the wet man. Rule 3. If someone claims to need help or wants to use the phone, direct them to the phone by the restroom, but do not offer additional assistance. "There's a phone by the restroom," I said, pointing toward the back of the diner. "Right through that door." She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "That's it? You're not going to help me? Look at my face." I could see her injuries clearly, and they looked real enough. Fresh blood, swelling that was already starting to set in, but the rules had been right about the wet man, down to every detail. I had to trust them now. "The phone's right back there," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can call whoever you need to call." She stared at me for another few seconds, then hurried toward the restroom area. I heard her pick up the phone and start dialing, her voice carrying back to the main dining area. "Hello? Yes, I need help. My boyfriend attacked me and I'm at some diner on the highway." I busied myself wiping down the counter, trying not to listen to her conversation while also trying not to think about how wrong this felt. She was clearly in trouble, clearly needed help, and I was just standing here following some bizarre rules that might not even mean anything. That's when I glanced up at the window. My blood turned to ice. The woman's reflection was there in the glass, but it wasn't matching her movements at all. While I could hear her on the phone behind me, voice shaking as she described her location, her reflection was gesturing wildly with both hands, mouth moving in completely different patterns. The reflection looked angry, aggressive, nothing like the desperate victim I'd seen walk through the door. I stared at the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The reflection appeared to be having an entirely different phone conversation, its mouth forming words that didn't match the scared, pleading voice I was hearing from the back of the diner. The body language was all wrong too. Where the real woman had seemed frightened and hurt, the reflection looked predatory. Rule 2. If you see something wrong with a customer's reflection in the windows, go to the storage room and wait until they leave. I started backing toward the storage room, moving as quietly as possible. Behind me, the woman's voice was getting louder. "What do you mean you can't send someone? This is an emergency. I'm bleeding." But when I risked a glance back, she was standing in the doorway between the dining area and the restroom, staring directly at me. The phone was still pressed to her ear, but her expression had changed completely. Instead of fear and pain, she was wearing a twisted smile that made my stomach drop. "Why won't you help me?" she called out, her voice still carrying that desperate edge even though her face looked like she was enjoying some private joke. I looked back at the window. Her reflection was laughing silently, mouth open wide in what should have been sound but wasn't making any noise I could hear. I bolted for the storage room and slammed the door behind me, fumbling for the lock with shaking hands. The small space was cramped and dark, filled with boxes of supplies and the smell of industrial cleaning products. I pressed my back against the door and tried to control my breathing. "Come on," the woman's voice came through the door, but the desperate tone was gone now. "I just need a little help, just a tiny bit of assistance. That's what good people do, isn't it? They help." Her voice was getting closer to the storage room door. I could hear her footsteps on the linoleum, slow and deliberate now instead of the frantic stumbling from when she'd first arrived. "I know you're in there," she continued, and now her voice sounded almost sing-song. "I can smell your fear. It's delicious. Much better than the last girl who worked here. She tried to help me too, you know. Sweet little Jacqueline. So eager to do the right thing." I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound. Whatever this thing was, it had encountered Jacqueline. It knew about the previous night shift worker. "The rules are so unfair, don't you think?" The voice was right outside the door now. "All those people who need help and you're supposed to just ignore them. What kind of person does that make you? What kind of monster refuses to help someone who's bleeding?" I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to remember exactly what the rule had said. Go to the storage room and wait until they leave. Just wait. Don't engage. Don't respond. Just wait. "I could make it so much easier for you," the voice continued. "You could help everyone. Every person who walks through that door, you could give them exactly what they need. Wouldn't that feel good? Wouldn't that be better than hiding in a closet like a coward?" The door handle rattled and I nearly screamed, but the lock held. "Fine," the voice said, and now it sounded petulant, like a child who'd been denied a toy. "Be that way, but I'll be back. I always come back. And eventually, someone will help me. Someone always does." The footsteps moved away from the door. I heard the front door chime ring, but I didn't move. I stayed pressed against the storage room door, counting my heartbeats and trying not to think about what I'd just heard. 20 minutes passed before I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The diner was empty, just like it had been after the wet man left. But when I looked at the windows, I could still see her reflection for a few more seconds. That twisted smile, those predatory eyes, before it finally faded away like smoke. I walked over to the phone by the restroom. The receiver was hanging properly in its cradle, but when I picked it up to check for a dial tone, the line was completely dead. Had been dead, probably, the entire time. She'd been pretending to make a call to no one. I slumped against the wall and tried to process what had just happened. 2 customers, 2 rules, 2 situations that made no logical sense but had played out exactly as Douglas's instructions had predicted. The rules weren't random. They were specific responses to specific threats that someone had encountered before. Someone had written these rules because they'd survived whatever I was dealing with, and they'd written them down so the next person wouldn't have to figure it out the hard way. I looked at the clock. 12:23 a.m. Still 6.5 hours until Douglas came back. Still 6.5 hours of whatever else might come walking through that door. But now I understood something important. The rules weren't suggestions or local customs or Douglas being paranoid. They were a survival guide. And if I wanted to make it through the night, I needed to follow them exactly, no matter how wrong it felt, even when every instinct I had was screaming at me to do the opposite. The clock showed 4:47 a.m. when the headlights swept across the parking lot. I'd been watching the empty highway for hours, jumping at every shadow and sound. So when an actual 18-wheeler pulled up to the diner, I almost cried with relief. A normal customer. Finally. The driver who walked through the door looked exactly like what you'd expect from a long-haul trucker. Tall and lean, wearing a denim shirt and work boots with the kind of weathered face that came from years of highway driving. He had kind eyes and a tired smile, and when he settled onto one of the counter stools, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "Morning," he said, pulling off his cap and running a hand through graying hair. "Hell of a night to be driving. Name's Eli." "Edna," I replied, grateful to have a conversation that felt normal. "What can I get you?" "Bacon cheeseburger with fries, if you don't mind. Been driving since Fairbanks, and I'm starving." He stretched his back and looked around the diner. "Nice little place you got here. Don't see many diners still operating on this stretch of highway." I started pulling ingredients from the cooler, my hands steadier than they'd been all night. This was familiar territory, taking orders, making small talk, cooking food, real customer service instead of whatever nightmare scenarios I'd been dealing with. "You drive this route often?" I asked, firing up the grill and laying strips of bacon across the surface. The sizzle was comforting, normal, exactly what a diner should sound like. "Every couple weeks," Eli said, settling in like he planned to stay a while. "Usually stop at the truck stop in Glen Allen, but they're closed for repairs. Lucky for me, you're open all night." I formed the burger patty and dropped it onto the grill next to the bacon. The familiar routine was exactly what I needed. Flip the bacon, season the meat, get the fries started. Just normal diner work, the kind of thing I'd done hundreds of times before. "Been working here long?" Eli asked. "Second night," I admitted, then immediately wondered if that made me sound incompetent. "Well, you seem to know what you're doing. That bacon smells incredible." The burger was cooking perfectly, the bacon crisping up just right. I was actually starting to relax when the stove made a sound I'd never heard before. Ding. Not the gentle ding of a timer or microwave. This was sharp and metallic, like someone had struck a bell with a hammer. It cut through the quiet diner so suddenly that both Eli and I jumped. Rule 4 hit me like a punch to the stomach. If the stove makes a ding sound, stop cooking immediately and throw away all food. I lunged for the controls and shut off all the burners, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bacon was still sizzling, the burger still cooking from residual heat, but I grabbed the spatula and started scraping everything into the trash. "Whoa, what's wrong?" Eli asked, half standing from his stool. "Did something burn?" That's when the smell hit me. Not the clean scent of cooking meat I'd been enjoying, but something putrid and organic, like roadkill that had been sitting in the sun for days. I gagged and covered my nose with my sleeve. The food on the grill was changing. The bacon, which had been perfectly normal 30 seconds ago, was now a sickly green color and seemed to be moving slightly, writhing like it was still alive. The burger patty had turned black and was bubbling with something that definitely wasn't grease. I scraped everything into the trash as fast as I could, then grabbed the whole bag and tied it shut. The smell was getting worse, making my eyes water. "Jesus," Eli said, covering his own nose. "What the hell happened to the food?" "I burned it," I lied, my voice shaking. "Sorry, I got distracted. Let me start over." I pulled fresh ingredients from the cooler, trying to act like this was normal, like food didn't just spontaneously rot on the grill for no reason. My hands were trembling as I laid out new bacon strips and formed another burger patty. "Burned?" Eli looked skeptical. "That didn't smell like burning. That smelled like something died." "Old grease," I said quickly. "Sometimes it gets rancid and makes everything taste awful. I should have cleaned the grill better." The new food cooked normally, thank God. No strange smells, no color changes, just regular bacon and burger doing exactly what they were supposed to do. I focused on breathing through my mouth and trying not to think about what I'd just thrown away. 10 minutes later, I set a perfectly normal bacon cheeseburger and fries in front of Eli. He looked at it suspiciously. "You sure this one's okay?" he asked. "Positive. Fresh ingredients, clean grill." He picked up the burger and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "Good," he said after swallowing. "But I gotta say, that first batch smelled amazing before whatever happened to it." "You sure you had to throw it all away? I don't mind well-done meat." My stomach dropped. "No, trust me, it was ruined. completely inedible. Come on, Eli grinned. I've been eating truck stop food for 15 years. My stomach can handle anything. You still got it in the trash? I hate to see good food go to waste. It wasn't good food, I said firmly. It was spoiled. But Eli was already standing up, looking toward the kitchen. Just let me take a look. If it's really that bad, I'll leave it alone. Please don't. He was already walking around the counter, heading for the trash bag I'd tied shut. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stop him, but I couldn't exactly explain that the food had turned into something unnatural because a supernatural stove had made a warning sound. Eli, seriously, you don't want to... He opened the bag and immediately recoiled. Christ, you weren't kidding. That's rank. But then he looked closer and his expression changed. Actually, you know what? It doesn't look that bad, just a little overcooked. I stared at him in horror. The meat I'd thrown away had been green and writhing, bubbling with something that definitely wasn't natural, but Eli was reaching into the trash like he was seeing something completely different. Don't, I said, but he was already pulling out a piece of the bacon. See? Just crispy. Nothing wrong with crispy bacon. He bit into it before I could stop him. For a moment, nothing happened. Eli chewed normally, swallowed, even smiled. Tastes fine to me. You worry too much. Then his expression changed. His eyes went wide and he started making choking sounds, grabbing at his throat with both hands. But it wasn't normal choking. His whole body was convulsing, like something inside him was fighting to get out. Eli! I ran around the counter toward him. He fell to his knees, still clutching his throat, making horrible gagging sounds that echoed through the empty diner. His face was turning red, then purple, and I could see something moving under the skin of his neck. I got behind him and wrapped my arms around his chest, pulling up hard in the Heimlich maneuver. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th try, something came out of his mouth. It wasn't food. It was about the size of a golf ball, dark and wet and moving with its own muscles. It hit the floor and immediately started scuttling toward the shadows under the counter, making a sound like clicking fingernails. Eli collapsed forward, gasping and retching. I grabbed a napkin dispenser and brought it down hard on the thing that had come out of his throat, crushing it with a wet popping sound that made my stomach turn. What the fuck? Eli wheezed, still on his hands and knees. What the fuck was that? I stared at the smear on the floor where the thing had been, my mind completely blank. How do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone they just coughed up something that shouldn't exist? I don't know, I whispered, and it was the truth. Eli struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter. His face was pale and sweaty, and he kept touching his throat like he couldn't believe what had just happened. That came out of me, he said, staring at the mess on the floor. That thing came out of my throat. I nodded, unable to speak, but I only took one bite of bacon. He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. What kind of place is this? What the hell is going on here? I looked at the clock, 5:23 a.m., less than an hour until Douglas came back. Less than an hour until I could get answers about what I'd just witnessed. I think, I said slowly, you should probably go to a hospital, get checked out. Eli was already reaching for his keys. Yeah, I think you're right. He paused at the door and looked back at me. You should quit this job. Whatever's happening here, it's not worth $18 an hour. The door chimed as he left, and I was alone again with the smell of disinfectant and the memory of something impossible crawling out of a man's throat. I looked at the rules again, reading number 4 with new understanding. The stove's warning hadn't been random. It had been protecting us from something that would have been much worse if we'd both eaten the contaminated food. Someone had learned that lesson the hard way. Someone had written it down so the next person wouldn't have to watch a customer die choking on something that shouldn't exist. I cleaned up the mess on the floor and tried not to think about what would have happened if I hadn't followed the rules. if I'd let Eli eat the whole meal, if I'd eaten some of it myself. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Almost time for Douglas to return, almost time to demand some real answers about what I'd gotten myself into. But first, I had to make it through the next hour without anyone else walking through that door. I walked into the diner at 7:30 to find Douglas's truck already in the parking lot, which was weird since he usually left before I arrived. Even weirder was the second car parked next to it, a beat-up Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better decades. The front door was unlocked, and when I pushed it open, I found Douglas sitting in one of the booths across from a woman I didn't recognize. She was maybe mid-30s, with long dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. They both looked up when I entered, and Douglas's expression was somewhere between guilty and relieved. "Edna," he said, standing up quickly. "Good, you're here. This is Jacqueline Salinas, the previous night shift worker, the one who'd called crying and refused to come back." I looked at her more carefully, noting the way she kept glancing toward the windows and how her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, like she was trying to warm herself from the inside out. "Hi," I said, not sure what else to add. "What do you say to someone who'd fled from the job you were currently doing?" "I asked her to come," Douglas continued, his voice strained. "After what you told me about last night, the customer who choked, the thing that came out of his throat. I thought maybe it was time you heard the whole story." Jacqueline looked at me with something that might have been sympathy or pity. "Douglas told me about the wet man and the woman with the bruises. You followed the rules?" "Yeah." I slid into the booth across from them, my stomach already knotting up. They worked exactly like they were supposed to, which is what's been freaking me out. "Good," Jacqueline said quietly. "That's good. I didn't follow them, not all of them anyway." Douglas shifted uncomfortably. "Tell her what happened. Tell her what he said to you." Jacqueline took a shaky breath and stared down at her coffee. 3 nights ago, the wet man came in just like he did with you. Soaking wet, asked for warm milk, the whole thing. But after he finished drinking, I couldn't help myself. I asked if he was okay, if he needed a towel or something. She paused, and I could see her hands trembling slightly around the mug. He looked at me for the longest time, and then he started talking. His voice was wrong, like it was coming from underwater or from very far away. He told me things about this place, about what happens to people who work the night shift here. "What kind of things?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "He said he used to work here 2 years ago. He was the night shift worker before me, the one Douglas told you about who just disappeared." She glanced at Douglas, who was staring at the table. "He didn't disappear. He broke the rules, and it changed him into something else, something that can't quite exist in the normal world anymore." My mouth went dry. "Changed him how?" "He tried to help the woman with the wrong reflection. She came in just like she did with you, beaten up, crying, asking to use the phone. But he didn't just direct her to the restroom. He offered her ice for her bruises, tried to comfort her, and when he touched her," Jacqueline shuddered, "he said it was like touching something dead that was pretending to be alive, cold and wrong and hungry." I thought about the reflection I'd seen in the window, the way it had moved independently of the woman's actual body. What is she? Something that feeds on people's desire to help others. She looks for the kind of person who can't stand to see someone suffering, and she uses that against them. The reflection shows what she really is underneath the disguise. Douglas finally spoke up. "My uncle left me notes along with the diner. I thought they were just the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone. But after what Jacqueline told me—" "What did the notes say?" I asked. "That this place sits on something thin, a weak spot where other things can slip through if they're drawn by the right conditions. Warmth, light, people traveling alone at night. The diner acts like a beacon." Jacqueline nodded. The wet man told me about the stove too, about why it makes that sound. There's something dead underneath the building, something that's been there for decades. When it starts to affect the gas line, the food becomes contaminated with these tiny organisms that— She stopped and took another shaky breath. That take over whatever eats them, turn them into something else from the inside out. I remembered the thing that had crawled out of Eli's throat, the way it had moved with its own purpose. How many people know about this? Not many, Douglas said, and most of them don't want to talk about it. My uncle wrote the rules based on 30 years of trial and error. People died learning some of those lessons. Then why keep the diner open? I asked. Why not just shut it down? Douglas looked ashamed. Because I need the money. Because I thought maybe the stories were exaggerated. Because I told myself that as long as people followed the rules, they'd be safe. But they're not safe, Jacqueline said quietly. Even following the rules perfectly, you're still exposed to things that shouldn't exist. I've been having nightmares ever since that night. Dreams about the wet man, about the woman, about things crawling up through the floor. I thought about my own dreams since starting this job, the way I'd been waking up with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sound of dripping water in my ears. The wet man, I said slowly. When he talked to you, was he trying to scare you or warn you? Warn me, Jacqueline said without hesitation. He was trying to protect me from making the same mistakes he did. He said that's what he does now, tries to keep other people from ending up like him. That changed everything. The wet man hadn't been a threat. He'd been trying to help in the only way he could. The rules weren't just about avoiding danger. They were about avoiding the specific mistakes that had cost him his humanity. There's more, Douglas said reluctantly. My uncle's notes mention other workers over the years, people who just stopped showing up or who left town suddenly without explanation. I think some of them broke different rules and faced different consequences. How many? I asked. 7, maybe 8, going back to when the diner first opened in 1987. I stared at him. And you still hired people to work nights? I pay double the going rate, he said defensively. I post the rules clearly. I tell people to follow them exactly. But you don't tell them why. Would you have taken the job if I told you the truth? I considered that. Probably not. But then again, I'd been pretty desperate. I might have, if I'd known what I was really dealing with. Jacqueline leaned forward. The thing is, knowing doesn't make it easier. It makes it worse, in some ways. Now, when I see wet footprints anywhere, I panic. When someone asks me for help, I wonder if they're really human. The knowledge changes you even if you escape. So what do? I asked. Quit like you did? I don't know, she admitted. Part of me thinks you should run as far from this place as possible, but another part of me thinks maybe you're stronger than I was. You followed the rules perfectly on your first night. That takes a special kind of discipline. Douglas cleared his throat. I've been thinking about selling the property. Maybe it's time to admit that some things aren't worth the profit. What would happen to the wet man? I asked. And the woman with the wrong reflection? Would they just find somewhere else to go? I don't know, Douglas said. My uncle's notes don't cover that. I looked around the diner, taking in the faded red vinyl and checkered floors, the coffee-stained counter, and the rules posted behind the register. Someone had to work here, or Douglas had to close it down. Those seemed to be the only options. I need to think about this, I said finally. Jacqueline reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. Whatever you decide, be careful. And remember, the rules exist because someone learned the hard way what happens when you break them. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to save anyone. Just survive. She stood up and gathered her purse. I should go. Being here makes me nervous. After she left, Douglas and I sat in silence for a few minutes. Finally, he spoke. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning. I thought maybe if you didn't know, it would be easier. It wouldn't have been, I said, but at least I would have understood what I was dealing with. He nodded and stood up. I'll leave you to think about it. But Edna, if you decide to stay, please be more careful than I've been. Don't let money or pride or anything else convince you to take risks that aren't worth taking. After he left, I sat alone in the diner as the sun finished setting outside. The rules on the wall looked different now that I understood their true purpose. They weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were a survival guide written in other people's blood. I thought about Jacqueline's haunted eyes and the wet man's desperate whisper when he'd asked for milk. I thought about Eli choking up something that shouldn't have existed, and the woman's reflection moving independently in the window. Most of all, I thought about the fact that I was probably going to stay anyway, not because I was brave, but because I was stubborn and broke, and maybe a little bit curious about what else might walk through that door. The clock on the wall read 8:15 p.m. Time to start another shift. I walked behind the counter and read the rules one more time, understanding now that each one represented someone's mistake, someone's pain, someone's transformation into something they'd never intended to become. Then I made fresh coffee and settled in to wait for whatever the night would bring. I checked the clock one more time, 11:43 p.m. My last shift at Murphy's Diner, and honestly, I was ready for it to be over. 3 nights of supernatural weirdness had been enough to convince me that $18 an hour wasn't worth risking my sanity, or worse. The familiar sound of dripping water reached me before I saw him. I looked up from wiping down the counter to find the wet man standing just inside the door, water pooling around his feet like always. But this time, I wasn't scared. After everything Jacqueline had told me, I understood what he was. "Warm milk?" I asked, already reaching for a mug. He shook his head, water droplets flying from his dark hair. "Not tonight. We need to talk." His voice still had that underwater quality, but it was clearer now, more urgent. I set the mug down and really looked at him. In the fluorescent light, I could see details I'd missed before. The way his clothes seemed to shift between wet and dry. How his pale eyes reflected light, like they were made of something other than normal tissue. "You're him," I said. "The night shift worker from before Jacqueline." "Marcus Chen," he said, and for a moment his voice sounded almost normal. "I worked here for 8 months before I screwed up, before I became this." I leaned against the counter, keeping my distance, but no longer terrified. "Jacqueline said you tried to help the woman with the wrong reflection." I touched her. His expression twisted with something that might have been regret. She was crying, bleeding, and I couldn't just stand there. So I reached out to comfort her, and the moment my skin made contact with hers, I felt what she really was underneath. Something cold and hungry and very, very old. Water dripped steadily from his fingertips onto the floor. She fed on that contact, on my desire to help. It changed me, pulled me halfway into whatever space she exists in. Now I'm stuck between worlds, not quite alive, but not able to die either. "That's horrible," I said, and meant it. "It gets worse." He moved closer to the counter, leaving wet footprints on the linoleum. "She's been getting stronger. Every person she encounters, every moment of fear and confusion she creates, it feeds her. And she's been targeting the night shift workers specifically because we're alone, isolated, perfect victims." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean targeting?" "The rules work for random encounters when she's just hunting. But tonight she's coming for you directly. No more pretending to need help, no more playing victim. She knows you've been following the rules perfectly, so she's changing tactics." I looked around the empty diner, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. "When?" "Soon. Maybe an hour, maybe less." He gestured toward the windows. "She'll show up in the reflections first, all of them at once. That's how you'll know she's here for real." "What am I supposed to do? The rules don't cover direct attacks." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges dark with water damage. "New rules. Things I've learned since becoming this. We're going to prepare. I unfolded the paper, squinting at the smudged handwriting. The instructions were specific and strange. Disconnect the gas line to the stove, create salt barriers at all entrances, turn every light in the building to maximum brightness, and stay behind the counter no matter what happened. Salt? I asked. She exists partially in our world and partially somewhere else. Salt disrupts that connection, makes it harder for her to maintain her form here. He pointed toward the kitchen. There should be industrial containers in the storage room. I found 3 large containers of salt and started pouring lines across the doorway, the windows, anywhere she might try to enter. Marcus worked on the gas line, his wet hands somehow able to grip the tools without slipping. "Why are you helping me?" I asked as I finished the barrier by the front door. "Because I couldn't save myself, but maybe I can save you. And because she needs to be stopped before she gets strong enough to leave this place and hunt elsewhere." The lights flickered suddenly, and we both froze. In the window behind the counter, I caught a glimpse of movement, not outside, but in the reflection itself, a figure that looked like the injured woman from my second night, but wrong somehow, distorted. "She's here," Marcus whispered. The reflection moved independently of anything in the real world, walking along the inside surface of the glass like it was solid ground. Then another reflection appeared in the coffee pot's chrome surface and another in the metal napkin dispensers. Within seconds, every reflective surface in the diner showed the same figure, the woman with the bruised face, but her injuries were shifting and changing like they were painted on with something that wouldn't stay still. "Remember," Marcus said, positioning himself between me and the windows. "Stay behind the counter, don't cross the salt lines, and whatever she says, don't listen." The front door didn't open. Instead, she simply stepped out of the window reflection and into the diner, like walking through water. The salt line at the entrance flared with a brief bright light, and she hissed and stepped back. "Clever," she said, and her voice was nothing like the desperate, frightened tone she'd used before. This was cold and amused, like she was enjoying a game. "But salt won't keep me out forever." She circled the diner's perimeter, testing the barriers. Each time she approached a salt line, the air shimmered and she pulled back with obvious irritation. "You know what I am now," she said, looking directly at me. "That takes some of the fun out of it. I prefer my meals confused and frightened." Marcus stepped forward, water streaming from his clothes. "Leave her alone. She's done nothing to you." The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but she has. She's been so good at following the rules, so disciplined. Do you know how frustrating it is to be denied a proper meal 3 nights in a row?" She moved to the center of the diner, just out of reach of the salt barriers. Up close, I could see that her injuries weren't healing or changing. They were moving, crawling across her skin like living things. "I've been patient," she continued. "I've played by the old rules, the ones your precious uncle wrote down. But I'm tired of being contained by some dead man's paranoia." "The rules protect people," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "The rules protect you from random encounters. They don't protect you from me when I decide to hunt seriously." She smiled, and her teeth were too sharp, too many. "Tonight I'm going to feed properly for the first time in months." Marcus moved closer to her, and I realized he was positioning himself for something. "You'll have to go through me first." "Gladly." They collided in the center of the diner, and it was like watching 2 forces of nature fight. Marcus was water and cold and desperate determination. She was hunger and malice and something that had been pretending to be human for far too long. They grappled, neither quite solid, both more real than anything I'd ever seen. I grabbed the light controls behind the counter and turned everything to maximum. The fluorescents blazed, the heat lamps glowed, even the emergency lighting kicked on. The woman shrieked and stumbled backward, her form becoming less stable in the harsh illumination. "The lights," Marcus gasped. "She can't maintain her form in direct light. That's why she only hunts at night. I found more switches, turning on every bulb in the building. The diner became blazingly bright, and the woman's shape began to waver like heat distortion. "This isn't over," she snarled, backing toward the windows. "I'll find another way. I always do." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You won't." He lunged forward and grabbed her, and they both began to fade, becoming translucent. I could see through them to the empty booths beyond. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "Taking her back where she belongs," Marcus called out, his voice already distant. "Tell Douglas to close this place. Some doors shouldn't be left open." They disappeared completely, leaving only wet footprints and the smell of ozone. The reflections in the windows showed nothing but the empty parking lot outside. I stood behind the counter for another hour, keeping all the lights blazing, but nothing else happened. When Douglas arrived at 6 a.m., he found me sitting in the brightest diner in Alaska, surrounded by salt lines and looking like I'd aged 10 years overnight. "What happened?" he asked, taking in the scene. I told him everything: Marcus's warning, the woman's direct attack, the fight, the way they'd both vanished into whatever space existed between worlds. When I finished, Douglas sat down heavily in one of the booths. "My uncle's journal mentioned something like this," he said quietly. "A final confrontation, when the things that slip through get strong enough to hunt actively instead of just waiting for victims. Marcus said to tell you to close the diner, that some doors shouldn't be left open." Douglas nodded slowly. "He's right. I've been selfish, keeping this place running when I knew the risks. People have died because I needed the money more than I needed a clear conscience." He stood up and walked to the phone behind the counter. "I'm calling a real estate agent, and then I'm calling the gas company to permanently disconnect the lines. Whatever's under this building can stay buried." I helped him clean up the salt and turn off the extra lights. As we worked, I kept glancing at the windows, but the reflections showed only what they should, the two of us cleaning up after the strangest night of my life. "What will you do now?" Douglas asked as we finished. "Find a normal job," I said. "Something where the biggest danger is difficult customers and bad tips." He handed me an envelope with my final paycheck, plus a substantial bonus. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for following the rules, for surviving long enough to help end this." I looked around the diner one last time, taking in the faded red vinyl and checkered floors, the coffee-stained counter and the rules that would never be needed again. It had been 3 nights of terror, but also 3 nights of learning that I was stronger than I'd thought. "Take care of yourself, Douglas," I said, and walked out into the morning sunlight. Behind me, Murphy's diner sat empty and quiet, its neon sign dark for the first time in decades. Some places were meant to close, and some doors were meant to stay shut. I drove away without looking back,